Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Centennial State, Colorado. Colorado contains about 75% of the land in the United States that sits at or above 10,000 feet in elevation. The state also contains the highest incorporated city in the entire country as well, that being Leadville, Colorado, which sits at an average of about 10,400 feet. Also, not far from the city of Leadville is a little town called Fairplay, which is what the fictional town of South Park is based on from the show of the same name. In fact, Colorado has the highest number of 14ers in the United States, and a 14er is basically a mountain peak that exceeds 14,000 feet in elevation. And the competition really doesn't even come close. I mean, the state with the second most is Alaska, but Colorado has, I believe, 53 different 14ers, which is almost twice as many as Alaska has. Moving right along into the politics of the state, Colorado has 7 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 4 Democrats to 3 Republicans. This is a reversal of power from the previous Congress, actually, when Republicans controlled 4 seats and Democrats controlled 3 seats. But that switched up in 2018 when Democratic now Representative Jason Crow won Colorado's 6th district. Colorado's 6 covers a lot of the eastern suburbs of Denver, including the entire town of Aurora. And he actually managed to win that pretty handily nearly 2 years ago. Colorado's 6th is one of 2 districts that I want to bring to your attention today, the other being Colorado's 3rd, but first let's focus on that 6th. So I just mentioned it's a very suburban district. The constituents actually voted for Obama in 2012 by about a 5% margin, and then for Hillary Clinton in 2016 by about a 9% margin. But the previous 3 election cycles prior to those, they broke for Republicans every single time. So over the course of 20 years, we see a suburban district that is getting pretty noticeably more Democrat as the years go by. Sitting Representative Democrat Jason Crow, his victory in 2018 actually marked the first time in the decades-long history of the district that a Democrat would represent it. And it's not even like he just barely squeaked by in 2018. I mean, he won with a pretty decisive 11% margin of victory in the state. Okay, and next I want to talk to you briefly about Colorado's 3rd district, which covers most of the western half of the state and is heavily rural for the most part. This is a district that is currently represented by Republican Scott Tipton. And interestingly enough, Scott Tipton is one of a small handful of representatives that got primaried this election season. He was challenged by a woman named Lauren Boebert from the town of Rifle, Colorado, who's a restaurateur who ran a campaign that was really heavy on Second Amendment rights, and she managed to actually defeat Scott Tipton by a pretty healthy 10% margin of the vote. And there's even more to the story of Colorado's 3rd this year. When tallying up the total amount of votes received for both parties in the primary, the amount that Democrats received nearly equaled that Republicans received in the district. And the Democratic candidate that actually came out on top, Diane Mitch Bush, won by a much healthier 23% margin of the vote against her challenger than Lauren Boebert did, upsetting Scott Tipton. It's a district that I would pay attention to, especially as more polls come out as we get closer to November. But lastly, we have to consider that the district does have a Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index lean of +6 into the Republican column when compared to the national average. And Colorado's 6th, which I was talking about earlier, has a lean of +2 into the Democratic column, meaning that it was always the more likely district to flip back in 2018. But how are Colorado's 3rd and 6th going to go this November? Let's pull up a double line graph to figure that out. So here we're looking at, within the state of Colorado, I think the clearest example of a galvanized Democratic base turning out big in 2018. These points on the graph represent the raw number of votes cast for House candidates in the entire state of Colorado. And over the last 10 years, it's been nearly even. I mean, Republicans and Democrats are very evenly distributed in Colorado, and that's generally reflected in the balance of power in the U.S. House for the state as well. But then, of course, a big thing happened in 2016. Donald Trump, to many people's surprise, was able to defeat Hillary Clinton in the presidential election, which seemingly was more than enough to turn out Democrats in a big way 2 years later, where their raw numbers just noticeably surpassed Republicans in a way where they were able to flip a pretty heavily suburban district in Colorado's 6th, one that, as I mentioned earlier, had never been represented by a Democrat in its decades-long history. Republicans, on the other hand, in 2018 fell down to pretty much expected levels for a midterm year. This is just another great example of suburban backlash against this sitting president. Okay, let's toss that graph aside. I'll tell you how I think Colorado's 3rd and 6th are going to go. First, Colorado's 6th is going to stay Democratic. Jason Crow won pretty decisively in a midterm year. I fully expect that gap to widen even further, actually, in Democrats' favor this November. I wouldn't be surprised to see him carry a second-term victory by over 15% margin of the vote. On the other hand, Colorado's third, where Lauren Boebert, the Republican, upset Scott Tipton, is going up against a Democratic challenger, Diane Mitch Bush. Bush won more decisively in her primary than Boebert did. However, because of the lean of the district, according to Cook, at +6 compared to the national average, I do think Boebert is going to be able to win this district, but by a pretty small margin. I would say probably less than 5%. And I feel pretty confident about that pretty small margin of victory on her end by looking at the primary results for the state, basically. I mean, the Democrats and Republicans in Colorado's third turned out in basically equal numbers, something that I'd never really seen for the area before. Ultimately, I do think it'll stay Republican, but by the closest of margins that it has seen in a long time. So at the end of the day, we have no net change in Colorado. We have it drifting to the left, but not enough to flip a second seat. So let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in Colorado. Incumbent Republican Cory Gardner is running for his second term against a challenger named John Hickenlooper, who is a former governor of the state of Colorado for 8 years and a former 2020 presidential candidate. Hickenlooper was the governor prior to this current governor serving Colorado, Jared Polis, from 2011 to 2019, and over that course of 8 years saw pretty substantial economic growth within the state. And actually, the GDP of Colorado was still increasing by the time he left office in early 2019. He also ran, as I just mentioned, a brief presidential campaign, but dropped out prior to any primaries. So I think it's safe to say that he is pretty fresh in the mind of voters across the state, and a very, very worthy challenger to Cory Gardner this November. But how have people from Colorado been casting votes for senators in general? Let's take a look at some voter turnout ratios to figure that out right now. So here we're looking at some values that, although they are pretty close to each other, are very consequential for the state of Colorado, and that is basically because of how close the raw turnout numbers were for House candidates that we just saw in the previous section. I mean, when you have nearly identical or identical turnout numbers for House candidates, the tiebreaker for Senatorial candidates comes into play in the form of these voter ratios. And as you can see from the chart here, Democrats have consistently over the last decade had the advantage in that regard. Cory Gardner's first electoral victory as a senator, of course, occurred in 2014, and he did have a 2% disadvantage in the Senatorial to House voter ratio, but he just narrowly won that state because raw House turnout numbers slightly favored Republicans in 2014. Of course, 2014 was a midterm year. Now he's running in a presidential election year, which could prove to be much tougher for a Republican in a state like Colorado. All right, now let's toss those values aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, Senator Gardner. As of this video, he is at a -3 net approval rating, meaning he's slightly underwater at this point. Specifically, 37% of people from Colorado approve of him and 40% disapprove. And when you break out your calculator, you'll find out that that is 77%, meaning that there's 23% of Colorado voters that are unaccounted for in those numbers. So an approval of -3, there's a lot of wiggle room in that value. And now that we have all of our variables, we have raw House turnout numbers for both parties, we have those voter turnout ratios, and we have the approval rating of the incumbent. We give those all to Pollbot to see how this is going to go down in November. Pollbot is going to be Gardner or Hickenlooper. And there we have our result, and it has John Hickenlooper, the Democrat, defeating incumbent Republican Senator Cory Gardner by about a 14.23% margin of the vote. This is a much more decisive victory on Hickenlooper's end than Cory Gardner ever enjoyed in 2014, and I can guarantee you it's mainly due to that huge leap in raw House turnout that we saw on Democrats' end, going from 2016 to 2018, and on top of that, they have a slight edge in those raw House turnout numbers. Cory Gardner's -3 approval rating is pretty inconsequential, I believe. I mean, it's nearly zero, and that barely plays into this equation. But there's enough going on here in Colorado that I can say with a fair amount of confidence that John Hickenlooper is going to flip the second Senate seat in Democrats' favor that we've seen so far in this series. Last week, we saw Sarah Gideon defeat Susan Collins in Maine. Prior to that, of course, we saw Tommy Tuberville defeating Democrat Doug Jones in Alabama. So by my count, that means we're at a net gain of +1 for Democrats in the Senate so far. Let's make that official and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Looking back to the beginning of the 21st century, you'll learn that Colorado voted for George W. Bush twice, actually, in 2000 and in 2004. But in the 3 presidential election cycles since then, they've always broken for Democrats. Most recently for Hillary Clinton by about 5% margin of victory. Compared to a lot of the states we've seen so far, it's fair to say that that's a pretty swingy nature that we're seeing in Colorado over the last 20 years. But let's really dive into how Colorado voters have been casting votes for presidents in the last 10 years by pulling up some more voter turnout ratios right now. And here we have some more values that are, yes, even more revealing. We're seeing an advantage on Democrats and for both the last presidential election cycles over the last 10 years, meaning that there was generally more enthusiasm for the Democratic candidate in both of these years than there was for the Republican candidate. But interestingly enough, both values drop off for Democrats and Republicans going from 2012 to 2016. What that tells me is that the average Colorado Democrat was way more enthused to vote for Barack Obama than they were for Hillary Clinton. And in the case of Republicans, they were much more enthused to vote for Mitt Romney over Donald Trump. Interestingly enough, the margin of victory that Obama enjoyed in 2012 was also about 5%. It was about the same as Hillary Clinton enjoyed in 2016, but there were a lot more votes cast for third-party candidates in 2016 than there were in 2012. So 2016 actually saw neither Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump crack 50% of the vote. Basically, what I take away from this is that there were heavily flawed candidates as perceived by the average Colorado voter 4 years ago, more noticeably than there was in 2012. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside. We see dipping enthusiasm on both Democrats and Republicans and in Colorado for presidential candidates going from 2012 to 2016. Lastly, we have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, President Trump. As of this video, his approval rating is at minus 24 points in the state of Colorado. Specifically, 36% approve of him versus 60% that disapprove, adding up to a 96% value, meaning that there's not much wiggle room for him. And now that we have everything we need, we can turn to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to turn out for Biden and Trump in Colorado. Pollbot. And there you have it. Joe Biden carrying the Centennial State of Colorado by 13.56% margin of victory. Yes, this is a smaller margin of victory than I predicted that John Hickenlooper would win the Senate seat over Cory Gardner, despite the fact that Trump's approval rating is much worse than Gardner's at this point. But it's important to note that this margin of victory of 13.56 is nearly 3 times as much actually as Hillary Clinton enjoyed in 2016. 13.56 is also a pretty substantial amount of margin of victory for a state that has until recently been considered a swing state. Trump couldn't pull through in Colorado 4 years ago, and he seemingly has given them little reason to give him a second chance. So now we know this. Let's make it official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So we have all the election results in for the state of Colorado, and we saw a flip in the Senate seat and another Democratic victory in the state at the presidential level. Let's talk briefly about the future of Colorado by looking at an old line graph and 2 new ones. And first, focusing on the raw House turnout numbers that we were seeing earlier in the video, let's look specifically at the slope values that you see accompanying both of those dotted lines that you can see in the graph. So that 126.8 value preceding X in the equation you see on top is for Democrats. What that number means is that when you look at the last 10 years, on average, every 2 years, Democratic House candidates have received 126,800 more votes than they did in the previous election cycle. Republicans also have a pretty impressive value of 53.7, so Republican candidates in the state as a whole have received 53,700 more votes than they did in the previous 2 years. But when you pit those two values against each other, I mean, you're seeing Democratic House candidates breaking away from Republican House candidates at a rate of nearly twice that Republicans are improving their numbers every 2 years. And it is all because of that jump from 2016 to 2018 on Democrats' end. I can guarantee you that's why their slope value is way more impressive than Republicans at this point. And next, looking at the other 2 line graphs, those are estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in those voter turnout ratios that I was using earlier in my calculations. The Senatorial to House voter ratio estimates are on the left, and you see Democrats having an advantage over Republicans, much like they do for presidential numbers as well, as you can see on the right. And actually for both parties, the enthusiasm is increasing, whereas for presidential candidates, the voter ratios are decreasing. And it's kind of hard to tell from these graphs, but actually Democrats are breaking away from Republicans in the senatorial category, furthering their advantage in enthusiasm in that category. Whereas for presidential candidates, they're both dropping off. But we saw Democrats drop off at a greater value going from Obama to Clinton than Republicans did going from Romney to Trump. So actually the values between Democrats and Republicans for those presidential numbers are tightening slightly. And these values do matter in a state like Colorado, where they have historically voted very close to each other in House elections. Of course, going into 2020, we'll have to see if that remains the case or if we're going to see another year like we just saw in 2018. Okay, tossing all of that aside, I'll give you my final consensus on Colorado. It is no longer a swing state. I mean, we saw massive shifts to the left in suburban areas of the state, and that 6th district I spent so much time talking about. And I think our raw House turnout graph perfectly visualizes that suburban swing to the left, and I don't see any reason why it would shift back to the center or to the right at all going into November. I think it's safe to say at this point that Colorado has left behind its swing state status for more likely Democrat territory going into future elections. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter and I update that account with which state I am covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.